I'm Professor Jeremy Burchardt. I'm a Professor of Rural History here in the Department of History at the University of Reading. And I've been fascinated by rural history for a long time. I joined the university back in 1997 in what was then the Rural History Centre, now the Museum of English Rural Life. And then I think it was about 2000, I joined the History Department. And my interests were initially in rural social history, but then I became interested in how the countryside is represented culturally. And from there, I moved on to how people have experienced landscape historically. And that led me, amongst many other kind of things, towards what I'm currently working on, which is the history of fences, which is a surprising topic, but I found it a very enjoyable and rewarding one. The history of fences doesn't sound like a very interesting topic. And that's actually why it's proved in some ways so rewarding for me, because no one has really looked at it that much. Certainly that's true in terms of British history. There's almost nothing about the history of fences in British history. And you may say, well, that's not surprising. Why would anybody be interested in fences? But I hope I can show you in a moment that there are really lots of reasons why probably all of us should be interested in fences. And certainly in other countries, people have been interested in fences, historians have been interested in fences. So for example, in the US, there's really very interesting and lively literature on the history of fences. And that's true in a number of other countries too, in Australia, but not here in Britain. In Britain, the only thing there really is quite a lot of work, some very good work, on the history of hedges. So hedges have appealed to people, I suppose, because of their ecological significance. But actually, if you look at fences in a broader sense, it turns out that fences are ecologically significant too, not always in a benign way, but they always do have an ecological significance. And people have also been interested in the history of hedges, I suppose, because of a sort of romantic identification with kind of English national identity. Hedges are often taken as being really a kind of classic symbol of the English countryside, although that's actually also in many respects misleading, because hedges are very far from being a purely British or even distinctively British phenomenon. But anyway, a lot of kind of interesting work has been done over the years on the history of hedges in Britain, but really nothing on the wider history of fences. There's a tiny bit on stone walls, although mainly focused on the actual kind of craft techniques of how you make stone walls, and upon a little bit on the kind of different kinds of stone walls that you get regionally. But in terms of the wider historical significance of walls, very, very little indeed. And as regards kind of wooden fences or wire fences, virtually nothing at all. And although, as I say, there have been kind of one or two countries, particularly the US, where the historians have paid some really interesting and valuable attention to fences, there's nothing like a kind of global history of fences at all. And yet actually they're kind of enormously significant. So why is it that in general we kind of think fences are kind of not really worthy of study, or so many historians and so many other scholars, because there's really not very much kind of scholarship on fences even beyond history scholarship. Why is it that fences have really escaped our attention for so long? So I think that the main reason, in a sort of ironic way, is that they're so normal, they're so ordinary. The truth is that kind of fences are everywhere. I challenge you to kind of go outside and look around you and see how many fences you can see. Unless you're a kind of Arctic explorer, or unless you're kind of in the middle of a kind of desert somewhere, I'd be extremely surprised if you can't see not just one but several fences the moment you go outside. That's how kind of pervasive and universal fences really are. So I think it's a bit like kind of, I don't know what, something like kind of the air or kind of pavements, or one of those kind of things that, because they're so sort of normal, because we just kind of take them for granted as kind of part of our sort of background, we don't really notice them most of the time. And I suppose it's also because fences are in some ways kind of quite passive. They kind of don't obviously kind of do anything. They don't tend to kind of move. Well, they do actually sometimes move a little bit, but it's true they don't move very much, and obviously not at their own volition. So they're not like, I don't know what, they're not like kind of animals, and they're not like something like, say, a kind of tank or something like that. They don't do anything kind of obvious and dramatic. They're sort of, in a way, they appear to be just passively there in the background. Although again, I'll say in a moment, explain in a moment, that actually fences are in many respects much less passive than we tend to imagine they are. So they're kind of there in the background, they don't seem to do anything, they're so common, so universal that, as I say, we just don't notice them as we kind of move around in our normal daily lives. I think you could really say that all this time fences have been hiding in plain sight. In fact, I'm thinking about using that as the subtitle for the book that I'm writing. I'm not quite sure yet what the final title will be, but hiding in plain sight is so very true of fences. So how did I get interested in fences, and why do I think they're such an interesting and important subject? Really a subject I feel that all of us actually ought to kind of really should think about. They've got huge kind of implications and very controversial implications when you begin to kind of explore how they've been created, what the history is, and what they actually do. I'll just say a little bit about how I came to be interested in this kind of surprising subject. So it was years and years ago now. I was walking along a very nice kind of footpath in Surrey on one of those beautiful kind of Surrey heaths. So the kind of landscape I'm talking about is a landscape of heather and Scots pines, possibly one or two gorse bushes, but it was mainly kind of heather and Scots pines, very, very attractive landscape. And I found that I was walking alongside a fence. The footpath ran alongside a fence. It wasn't a particularly dramatic fence. I think from memory, I can't quite recollect this bit, but I think from memory it was just a kind of ordinary plain wire fence. I don't think it was even a barbed wire fence, just an ordinary plain wire fence. And on my side of the fence there was this charming landscape of Scots pines and heather. On the other side of the fence there was the same charming landscape of Scots pine and heather, but on my side of the fence, it was a common and you could go really wherever you wanted. On the other side of the fence, it was someone's private estate. It was one of those kind of very rich people's mansions that you find a lot of in Surrey. And this was really basically their back garden. But as with some of these kind of very wealthy kind of rich people's kind of houses and extensive gardens, it was so large that it looked just like kind of countryside. But the thing that struck me so forcibly then was how completely arbitrary property divisions are. They may be a good thing, they may be a bad thing, you could take different views on that, but it's really beyond question, it's beyond denial that they are a completely arbitrary human invention. Someone had decided, and that had then been kind of presumably legally kind of endorsed, that the land on one side was open common and the land on the other side was designated as somebody's private personal possession. And what was it that actually inscribed that division on the landscape? It was the fence, of course. What was it that actually enforced that division? What was it that made it impossible? Or, I mean, of course, I suppose I could have tried to clamber over the fence if I'd made a big effort, but what was it that made it in practice very difficult for me to go over into the kind of private landscape? Again, it was the fence that did that. So fences are both the kind of symbol of property divisions in land, and they're, to a very large extent, what actually implement and enforce those property divisions. So the history of fences is really the history of property. I mean, you can more or less say that without fences, you can't really have landed property. Something which is just a line on a map doesn't really have any kind of meaningful existence in the real world in terms of our day-to-day practice. So fences are absolutely vital and fundamental in that way. Then, of course, that's only part of it. The fence that I was kind of walking along was a fence which divided two areas which weren't in use for agriculture. But we can go beyond saying that no fences would mean no landed property. And I think on the whole, since landed property is the most fundamental and probably the original type of property, we could almost say that if we have no landed property, then kind of all questions about property become in doubt. So no fences, no property, but I think we can also say no fences, no agriculture, although perhaps we ought to qualify that a little bit because it's really livestock farming which depends on fences. Without fences, your cattle are just going to kind of wander everywhere. In the modern world, that would be kind of completely unviable. They'd be causing chaos. They'd be getting kind of killed on the roads, causing accidents everywhere. And of course, they would be kind of eating crops. So you can't have a mixed agriculture where you have kind of livestock farming and also crop farming if you don't have fences. So certainly we can say no fences, no livestock farming, at least in the way that we know it. So they really are kind of absolutely fundamental to the modern world. And when I say the modern world, I mean the modern world that has emerged over actually, this is really a sort of archaeological perspective. I mean the modern world as it's emerged since the kind of dawn of agriculture about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. That's how fundamental fences are. But when I began to research fences, because I mean, as I say, I was so struck by this, it seemed to me that this was this absolutely kind of vital and fundamental feature of the world that we live in. So when I began to research them in detail, I found that they were even more surprising and interesting than I'd realised. For example, I had been assuming that the origin of fences went back pretty much to the dawn of agriculture, as I said, to about 10,000 years ago. I had assumed that before then, everyone was hunter-gatherer, and hunter-gatherers wouldn't have needed fences because they had no livestock. That turned out not to be true at all. In fact, fences are far older than agriculture. And this is because hunter-gatherers actually did construct fences on quite a large scale. That's not to say that they were frequent. Certainly, hunter-gatherers had far fewer miles of fence per land unit, land area per what we would now call acre or square mile or square kilometre, whatever you want to call it, than we do today, far fewer. But they constructed some really quite big and major fences, many of which have kind of lasted archaeologically. They did this because they used fences to trap animals. So they were hunters as well as gatherers. And you can construct a line of boulders, for example, which you can use to channel, in particular, kind of large migratory mammals, like, for example, deer is a classic case. And you can use these fences to channel animals to a kind of concealed kind of killing pit, for example, or an area where you can corral them and then kill them. So sometimes these are of stone, and these have survived particularly in desert areas where there's been kind of nothing which has really disturbed them. So they're known as desert kites in those areas. So many of these have survived, and more are actually being identified by use of kind of aerial photography, satellite photography, drone photography. So that's one kind of hunter-gatherer fence. But they also actually constructed wooden fences. Now, these haven't survived, of course, archaeologically on the whole, or very rarely. But we do know about them because there are some remarkable rock art drawings which show, and this is particularly in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway, remarkable rock art drawings which show reindeer being herded by means of these kind of wooden fences into a kind of corral where they can be killed. Also, fences were used, both stone and wooden fences and wattle fences, wattle being a kind of woven kind of wooden fence, generally quite light and portable. So stone and wooden and wattle fences were used all around the world, really, as far as we can work out, as a means of trapping fish. Again, it works best where you've got kind of either migratory fish or migratory mammals, because then you have kind of known, established migratory routes, and you can kind of prepare the trap long in advance, as you have to with these big structures, and they will trap animals. So these go back tens and tens of thousands of years, long before agriculture. So fences really go back a very long way indeed. And there are some indications that they may go back possibly even further than that, maybe, and had other uses as well. For example, in certain parts of the world, fence-like structures, sometimes wattle, sometimes stone, have been discovered which were used as windbreaks, because wind was a major problem in terms, for example, of a good example would be a kind of cave, which is all very well, but not if the wind is blowing straight into it. So there's evidence that prehistoric people used fences as a kind of windbreak. So fences go back a really long way. And although the history of property is absolutely kind of, you can't really talk about the history of property, I think, in practical terms without talking about fences, that's not the kind of origin of fences, and it's not their only application. So I'm still in the kind of early stages of researching the history of fences, but one thing which is already becoming clear is that the number of fences has absolutely proliferated in the last 200 years. And this is largely because of the Industrial Revolution and because of urbanization. There's a very close relationship between the number of fences, the kind of length of fence per, as I say, unit land area, and the density of settlement, because fences are not only used for agriculture at all. In fact, they're used for a huge variety of purposes to protect property and to keep people out, keep people out and keep animals out, and sometimes to keep animals in, and sometimes to keep people in as well, as in the case of kind of prison camps, for example. So fences are absolutely proliferating at a kind of ever-increasing rate, I think probably at an exponential rate, without noticing it in the last 200 years, and especially increasingly in the kind of last few decades. We are really kind of fencing ourselves in. This is a kind of major development which has kind of really gone under the radar almost completely. It's something I think we really need to think about. What kind of a world are we creating? I mean, ultimately where this is heading to is a world where, apart from those areas which are just completely uninhabited and not used for agriculture, so the deserts and the kind of permanent kind of ice sheets and I mean, of course, the oceans. Apart from there, we're kind of heading towards a world where basically everything is going to be fenced. Is that the kind of world we want? It's certainly the world that we're creating without really having noticed it or thought about it. So these are big issues. Just as a kind of indication of how little we kind of know at the moment about the history of fences or about fences altogether, we have no idea about how many miles of fence there are in the world altogether. We can make some very good projections and estimates based on the local incidence of fencing, but no one's tried to kind of measure the total length of fence in the world. It's vast, it's absolutely stupendously vast. I've done a very kind of rough back of envelope kind of calculations, and they yield a kind of range of results, but actually not too dissimilar. And very roughly, the kind of length that we're talking about now in the world today, it's roughly the kind of, it seems to be roughly the kind of, astonishingly, staggeringly, it seems to be roughly the kind of distance from the Earth to the Sun. So we're talking about kind of over 90 million miles of fences. It's almost unthinkable how actually in practice those regimes could have operated without barbed wire. So electrified wire was also used extremely viciously. So, and this still goes on. We still have concentration camps like Guantanamo Bay, which is a concentration camp in all but name, and we have other kind of repressive prison camps, sadly, kind of around in many different parts of the world. So the kind of dark, repressive aspect of fencing is still very much with us as well. I'll just say something very briefly about another dimension of fencing, which specialists are aware of, specialist researchers are aware of, but I think most of us really aren't. I certainly hadn't really thought about this until I began to study fences. And that's the kind of ecological aspect of fences. So it's not just that fences really kind of have a major repressive potential, a very, as I say, very dark and serious kind of repressive potential in human terms. They can also be profoundly destructive environmentally, profoundly harmful to wildlife. So classic examples of this are kind of game fencing in Africa. So a terrible example was in Botswana, where many miles of very robust game fencing have been constructed, and this has resulted in the deaths of thousands and thousands of wildebeest and other large migratory mammals. But it's not just in Africa. Then you can think about Australia, where there's a long history of trying to construct vast fences. In fact, the world's longest fence is, depending on how you define a fence, but if we're looking at a kind of continuous structure, it's not the Great Wall of China, certainly not. Which, by the way, I'm sad to say, cannot be seen from space, it's far too narrow. But it's not the Great Wall of China, which is the world's longest fence. It's almost certainly Australia's kind of dingo fence, or dog fence, as it's sometimes called. So Australia has a long history of constructing these huge fences in terms of their length, and they're very destructive in terms of wildlife, and most notably in relation to emus. Some of these fences, they weren't originally constructed to keep emus out. Many of them were constructed originally to try to keep rabbits out. It kind of didn't work, but they've now been, some of them, repurposed as emu fences. But there are huge kind of emu migrations which occur in some years. And this is because of Australia's very fickle climate, that sometimes you get kind of very dry seasons in particular bits of Australia, and the emus need to move to somewhere where they can find food. And these thousands of emus die along these emu fences because they can't get from where there's no food to where they need to. And in more minor ways, you can also find fences actually right throughout the world, badly designed fences, or fences which have just been constructed with no thought whatsoever about the impact on wildlife, which do cause major problems for animals in terms of preventing them from getting access to where they need to go for kind of habitat purposes, or most often for food, and sometimes for reproductive reasons as well. So fences have major ecological implications which we've hardly thought about. So this is really just kind of scratching the surface with the history of fences, but I hope I've said enough to show you that it's a really kind of fascinating area, that fences do far more work of possibly good kinds, certainly sometimes good kinds, but very often of quite a questionable sort of way. And I think we need to kind of keep in mind that the fundamental thing about a fence is that it's always there to stop someone or something. It's always there to stop a person or people or animals from doing something that they would otherwise want. Now, obviously, sometimes kind of people or animals kind of want to do things which we don't want them to do. That's in a way why we have fences. But nevertheless, fundamentally, a fence is there to stop someone, some living being, from doing something that it would otherwise want to. Another way of kind of saying that, much more succinctly, is that a fence is always coercive. Now, I think almost all of us regard coercion as, in principle, a bad thing. Fences are basically a bad thing. We need to have fewer fences, not more fences. And certainly we need to think much more carefully about what fences are doing, about whether we want them to be doing that, and about how we can design. We can't, in practice, of course, we can't, it's completely utopian to think we could get rid of all fences. We can't do that. That's not going to happen. But what we can do is be much more aware, I think, of what fences actually are, what fences actually do, and in particular of how we design fences. And there are kind of much better ways to design fences, ways which cause much less kind of inadvertent harm, both to people and to wildlife. And that's really what we need to think about much more than we have been. And that's, I suppose, the main thing that I hope my research will eventually contribute to.